Closing the doors. Good evening, everybody in London, that is. We have a good attendance in the room. Thank you very much for coming. We also have a very strong attendance, I think, online. So this is a mixed event, in person and online this evening. It is being live streamed, and we're going to be discussing the question of how the new administration will reorder US foreign policy. I'm Simon Fraser. I'm going to be chairing this event, and I am the chair of the council here at Chatham House. There are many big issues for us to discuss this evening. A lot of ink has already been spilt in the run-up to the election, and certainly this is, I think, the opening of a new chapter in American foreign policy. Many words have been used about it: mercantilist, transactional, not driven by sentiment or values, unashamedly America first. So we need to work through all that. I think it's fair to say it's early days. We've had some initial announcements since the inauguration on tariffs, the Panama Canal, China, Mexico, Canada, and a few other issues, including, of course, the border. Also on green energy and other domestically related, but also internationally relevant issues. But I'd say, if anything, actually, the opening salvos from President Trump have perhaps been less dramatic than some people had been suggesting, and some of us were expecting. So that raises the familiar question for us of the boundary between rhetoric and intent with President Trump. And, you know, we should certainly take him seriously, but to what extent should we take him literally? Well, I'm joined this evening by a very distinguished panel to discuss those things, and I'm very pleased that we are joined online by Dr. Lisa Curtis, who is a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She is a distinguished scholar and practitioner of foreign policy, and she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and NSC Senior Director for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021, so through the first Trump presidency. Then on stage, I'm very pleased that we are joined by Mark Landler, who is the London Bureau Chief for the New York Times. He's been in London for a long time watching British politics and our international relations. He was also, among many other distinguished roles, the White House correspondent covering both the Obama and Trump 1 administrations. And finally, last but not least, of course, our very own Dr. Leslie Vinjamori, Director of our US and Americas program and Professor of International Relations at SOAS, who needs no introduction and is a distinguished commentator on these matters. So that's our panel. I'm going to just remind you that this is on the record and is being live streamed. You can send X. You can post X's, or tweet, as we used to say, on hashtag CH events. And we'll talk for about half an hour, and then I'll open the floor up to questions. And I can take questions online as well. So if you're online and you want to ask a question, please submit that throughout the event using the Q&A box that appears at the bottom of the Zoom feed, and I will try to pick some of those questions up. Right, that's enough from me. I'm going to, if I may, go first of all to you, Lisa, because you're the person on the spot. Tell us what's happened, what it feels like, and your initial impressions of the incoming pronouncements of the administration.
Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you to Chatham House for inviting me. It's great to be here, especially with Mark and Leslie. And yes, I have to say there is a very palpable feeling that things are changing here in DC, and they're changing quickly. It's been a dizzying 48 hours with the slew of executive orders that have been issued, with the numerous tweets on personnel issues that have been coming through. And for many of us, it's a feeling of Groundhog Day. We remember this environment, and this sense of you have to really keep watch on your X, formerly Twitter account, to know what is happening and what is Trump's latest thinking and latest activity. So we know a few things about the likely future direction of this second Trump administration and its foreign policy. The executive orders have come fast and furious on immigration, including the suspension of the U.S. refugee assistance program, something that was done, of course, in 2017 in the first Trump administration as well. So, that is going to herald many changes to the refugee program. There has been an executive order suspending all international assistance so that they can conduct a 90-day review on that assistance, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, from the World Health Organization. So I think, this is what an America First policy looks like. But none of it should be surprising. If you've been listening to Trump over the last several months, I think, Simon, you said this, it's not shocking, even though a lot has been announced. But I also would say that we should look at, what Secretary of State Rubio is doing. One of his first acts was to hold a Quad meeting with the foreign ministers of India, Japan, and Australia. This shows that the Quad will remain an important forum for engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, the Quad was revived under the first Trump administration after a 10-year hiatus. And it's really become a very effective, we'll call it minilateral mechanism. And I think we can see that it will continue into the Trump administration. But let me say just a couple words about China, because clearly that will be the foreign policy priority for the Trump administration. But I think we can expect a more nuanced approach to China than many people may have guessed initially. I think this will likely include strong personal engagement between President Trump and President Xi, while at the same time, the prioritization of policies that will allow the U.S. to effectively compete with China. I think people like National Security Advisor Waltz and Secretary of State Rubio will be pressing policies that ensure the U.S. is competing effectively with China, things like technology restrictions, restrictions on investments, U.S. investments into China, developing alternative supply chains for critical minerals and technologies, sending clear signals on U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan and allies like the Philippines, which has been coming under pressure from China in the South China Sea. So I think, we're going to see both happening at the same time. President Trump will want to try to come to some kind of trade deal with China. We can't forget that he concluded the phase one trade deal with China in January 2020 before the COVID crisis kicked in. And of course, the U.S.-China relationship went south after that. But, the fact is, he is a negotiator. He's going to want to negotiate. He has indicated he wants to travel to China. So, it seems clear that he has this personal interest in trying to set the stage for better relations between the U.S. and China. And the last thing I will say is the TikTok issue shows that President Trump can change his mind. Unpredictability is part of his nature. It's part of his brand. So I think we can certainly expect more of that in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We'll come back and pick up some of those points. But your point on China and the nuance point, I think, is really interesting for us to explore a bit further, because a lot of the talk here is very simplistic. It's about tariffs and rather aggressive trade action. So we need to unpick that. But I'll come back to you a bit later. Mark, if I could come to you, first of all, you've experience of working as a journalist in the White House, so that'd be very interesting to hear your sense and maybe how you think this administration may differ from the previous administration. And then if you could tell us a bit about your impression of European reactions so far and what the Europeans will be thinking about this.
Sure. Thank you, Simon and Leslie. It's great to be back here. And hello to Lisa. I sat on a number of conference calls being talked through the foreign policy of President Trump on Afghanistan and other issues that Lisa was heading up in her days on the NSC. A couple of points about differences between the first term and the second term. And some of these you will have no doubt read a lot and heard a lot about. But President Trump came into the last term in an almost accidental way. He didn't really have much of a foreign policy cohort. He relied on people who he knew by reputation, but had no particular loyalty to him. And I think that actually filtered into the way some of the key agencies of the government conducted themselves during the first term. I'm thinking of the Pentagon under General Jim Mattis. I'm thinking about the State Department under Rex Tillerson, the former chairman of ExxonMobil. I think that the result in the first term was a president who had a few fixed ideological interests and a lot of opinions that he dropped at all hours of day and night on what was then known as Twitter. And then you had the agencies themselves that were still staffed by a career bureaucracy that was, really still quite empowered and ready to resist the president at times if they felt that he was going off the rails. And so foreign policy during that first term, to me, sometimes had a kind of a bifurcated nature. If you think of Russia, for example, the State Department and the NSC ran a rather traditional Russia policy. It involved sanctions. It even involved expelling diplomats from time to time from Russia diplomatic outposts in the U.S. At the very moment that Trump was tweeting about his famous friendship with Vladimir Putin and appearing in public forums with Putin where he was taking Putin's side over his own intelligence officials on issues of had Russia intervened or interfered in our election. So during those days, I felt that foreign policy was almost a bit schizophrenic. I don't believe any of that will happen this time around for a couple of reasons. One, the cabinet secretaries in all of these jobs are people that know Trump well and have been chosen largely because of their loyalty to him. And secondly, even among the higher levels of the bureaucracy, the administration's already moving to take out people that they do not believe are going to be 100% behind the president's America First policy. So I don't think you'll see a deep state, if you will, or a career bureaucracy that will be at odds with the president. And so for that reason, I think we might actually see the agencies more coordinated with the president, accepting the fact, as Lisa points out, there's an inherent unpredictability to President Trump's own opinions. And then very quickly on Europe, I like to think of the way foreign leaders have dealt with Trump a little bit by thinking of the 7 stages of grief. Anger, denial, grief. I think we're in bargaining. I think that now a lot of leaders are looking at Trump and sort of thinking, well, if I give him this, can I get that? If I'm willing to see something there, can I? And that's not wrong because he is fundamentally transactional, and leaders that did comparatively well with him the first time around got that insight very quickly. So I think that in Europe, you're seeing a lot of leaders already adopt that posture. I think that Europe has a couple of major problems. One, it's not very well placed in terms of its own leadership right now. We have a Germany with a lame duck government. We have a president in France who's been really, really hurt domestically by a self-inflicted wound of calling snap elections last summer. In Britain, we have a new prime minister who was elected with a commanding majority, but is now kind of in the trenches trying to find his own footing. So it's not a Europe with a particularly unified or powerful set of leaders. And then you have a president who I think will probably pursue, to some extent, a divide and conquer strategy, one that will not regard the European Union or European unity as a goal to be sought, but as something to be fought against. So I think Europe is bargaining, maybe the best they can do right now, but I don't think that we're in a moment where Europe can set itself up particularly robustly against Trump.
No, I agree with that. And there's some very big issues which we'll come to, like on NATO, on China policy, on defence spending, where there are obvious pressure points that will emerge, I think. So that's an interesting perspective, and we'll explore it further. But before that, Leslie, let me go to you. I mean, please share your thoughts on what's been said so far overall. But I'd also welcome if you could sort of pick up a couple of the hotspot issues. So Ukraine, where's he going on Ukraine, and the Middle East. What next in the Middle East? If we could cover those off, I think it'd be very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree largely with what Lisa and Mark said, and especially on this idea that there might be a more nuanced policy with respect to China, more nuanced than the Biden administration, which will be interesting to watch. But it's clearly, to play for. The one thing that I'm not sure I agree with, although I agree with your assessment, Simon, that it's sort of less I don't know which word you used, outrageous or something,
I can't remember what word I used, but
than we expected.
dramatic, but maybe
less
in your
dramatic.
face would be the right.
So less dramatic. So it was less dramatic for Europe. It was less dramatic for China, less dramatic for Iran, North Korea, you know, America's adversaries. But if you're Mexico, if you're Canada, if you are LGBTQ, if you are, you know, in various minority statuses in the United States, if you're sort of on the, you know, committed to the, I hate to use a word because it's such a, you know, but woke agenda. And I know that's not what you're referring to, but there are a lot of people right now that feel phenomenally insecure.
The sort of liberal social agenda.
Exactly, but also, you know, if you were, as I heard, we all probably heard on, I don't know which radio station, a woman who just had a C-section and thought she had an appointment to, an asylum seeker to legally cross the border and have that meeting, which she had applied through the CBP1 app, which was a very strong success of the Biden administration for controlling the border, because there has been a very serious problem, and the numbers have come down from what was a real crisis, and there have been many mechanisms put in place to deal with what has been a very serious crisis. And, you know, one of those things was just reversed. So for some people, this is a very dark and very dangerous period. But I think on the things that we have been more focused on here, tariffs and questions of war and peace, that there was sort of less in it. And so he's clearly waiting to play. So let me say a couple of things very quickly on Ukraine and on the Middle East. And one should never say things quickly. So it's just an opening comment. You know, we all like to say every president has sort of America, you know, first in mind. But actually for at least 3 or 4 decades, America thought that putting America's interests first meant putting other people's interests first, because in the medium and long term, America would benefit from that. So on Ukraine, we've seen lots of problems with Biden's policy, and we've aired those critiques here, the Russian Eurasia program. But one thing the Biden administration sort of always said was, you know, it's got to be what Ukraine wants has to come first. And I don't think that's going to be Trump's position. So first thing is, as the Trump administration moves towards some sort of negotiation, I think they're going to be thinking about what is America's interest in solving this war, not as what is Ukraine's interest. And that's actually a very significant break. And we've heard the different proposals for how, you know, the president might get the two parties to the negotiating table. We haven't really heard a good answer on the question of security insurances, and the broader question of, you know, will Ukraine be sovereign to lean west? So I think there's a whole lot to play for there, and let's wait and see whether part of that nuanced relationship with China is about having some sort of linkage politics that brings China to the table on the question of putting pressure on Russia. So we know that they want to do it in 100 days now, not one day, and we really don't know what the sequencing is going to look like or how that's going to turn out. I guess just one word.
So we rolled it back to 6 months now, is it? It's gone
well,
from 100 days to...
100 days, 6 months. I mean,
it's going to happen.
It might not happen,
It's intended
actually.
to happen.
It actually might happen, but because it's not clear to see how it does happen in a way that the U.S. is going to support.
What about the Middle East?
So in the Middle East, how do we get to phase 2? And I think that, you know, the negotiation for phase 2 begins on day 16, which is, 2 weeks from today? And this is now Donald Trump's problem. And along with, obviously, the other partners in those negotiations. And it's very hard to see the way through that. We know that, you know, if there was a way through this, then there's a broader set of things that Trump would like to do, Saudi and Israel normalization, a deal with Iran. But I have not heard articulated any solution or even proposal for the question of Palestine, Palestinian sovereignty, let alone Gaza. So I think we're a little bit stuck.
Many questions and many interrelated issues in the Middle East. I'm sure we'll come back to the Middle East, and there are questions on Iran and other things, so we will. But before we do that, let me go back to you, Lisa, if I may, because, I mean, you're an expert. I mean, we tend to be rather Eurocentric because here we are in London, but you're an expert on South Asian affairs, and you've talked a bit about China, but looking elsewhere in the region, there are many other important sort of focuses of American policy. And we have to keep on reminding ourselves, America is not facing Europe as much as it's facing Asia and other parts of the world these days. So what about India? What about Japan? I mean, how do those countries read Trump's arrival, and what do you read of American policy towards them?
Well, thank you. Yeah, when it comes to India, there is definitely a history of a relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. They, had several meetings together, and Trump won. You had the Howdy Modi event in the United States with, 50,000 Indian Americans at the Astrodome in Houston, Texas. 2 months later, you had President Trump addressing 100,000 Indians in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat, India. And I think they both respect each other as leaders, and they have a lot in common in terms of how they view themselves and their leadership. So that has kind of created a bond, I think, between the two of them. And, so I think you will see the U.S.-India relationship move forward. Trump's also said he wants to travel to India. Frankly, it would be unprecedented for a U.S. president in his first year of a 4-year term to visit India. That just hasn't happened in the past. So I think we can expect to see that relationship move forward, and it will, continue to be viewed. India will continue to be viewed, as the Biden administration viewed India, as extremely important when it comes to dealing with China, competing with China, countering China. So I would fully expect that relationship to move forward. AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US agreement, Pillar 1 to provide Australia with nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines. Pillar 2, which talks about the 3 countries working closely to advance capabilities. I think that will likely stay on track. We have seen Secretary of State Rubio, as well as National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, support this agreement when they were on Capitol Hill. So I see that moving forward as well. When it comes to NATO, I think that, U.S. leadership of NATO has really helped create the peace in Europe. So when Trump says he wants to be remembered for keeping peace in the world, I think, he has to be thinking about his legacy, right? He can't run for another term. So I think if he were to withdraw U.S. leadership from NATO, that would really go against his goal of wanting to be seen as a peacemaker. And, relinquishing that U.S. leadership role of NATO would simply diminish American influence and power. It goes without saying. So why would Trump want to be remembered for diminishing American influence and power? I think his tough talk on tariffs, shows that he wants to get a good deal for Americans. This is part of his negotiating tactic. Even with India, in his first term, before any meeting with Modi, he would always tweet out something about India's high tariffs. So I think, we need to see that for what it is. It's a negotiating tactic. But at the same time, one can't deny that if you want a stable Indo-Pacific, if you want peace in the Indo-Pacific, you also need to have a stable Europe. You need to have peace in Europe, and you need to have countries that can protect their own sovereignty. Of course, here I'm referring to Ukraine. So I think that even though, again, the sort of black and white view was, maybe Trump would come in, stop support to Ukraine, get friendly with Russia. I think it's going to be more nuanced because, he also doesn't want to do something that is going to show the U.S. is weak or stepping back. I think, when it comes down to it, he would like to see the U.S. Continue to have influence throughout the world, and that includes Europe.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, your comments as somebody who's worked in a Trump administration are very interesting for us because you're bringing balance to the debate. But I would say It's one thing not to withdraw from NATO, but it's a different thing to maintain a credible American commitment to Article 5 in its full extent. And I think that's one of the things that Europeans will look at, and have some questions about the extent of America's commitment there, which plays into the question of how he's going to address Russia and Ukraine. But I'm sure we can pick that up a bit later on. What I want to do just now, actually I'd like to go back to you, Leslie, if I can, and I'd like to try and draw this together a bit before we go to the audience. And picking up actually already now one of the questions that I've got on the screen, which is from Dr. David Jeletz, which says, how could we define a Trump doctrine in foreign policy? So, I mean, maybe it's not a Trump doctrine, but I mean, if we just look at what's happened, what's been said before and what's actually happened so far, recognizing this is early days, I mean, what does it tell us about the overall intent? There was a lot of discussion about a strategy of spheres of influence, sort of hemispheric spheres of influence, a great power geopolitics based around the US, China, possibly Russia, which of course is worrying for Europeans. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so it's like the children's game where there's a lot of dots and you have to fill them in and connect them. I think that's what we're all trying to do. And I say that as a serious point because we try to create a doctrine where there are a lot of beliefs, views, policies, instincts, but not necessarily a coherent doctrine. But I think those of us who think a lot about foreign policy could certainly create one. But there is a genuinely interesting debate, as you and the individual who's written in the question allude to. And one of them is, is this are these tactics aiming at establishing, if not a U.S. sphere of influence, from the south to the north in the United States, Panama on up, including Greenland, or is there also extending beyond that some sort of notion of spheres of influence more generally, and that Trump would be willing to do a deal that says, okay, China, you have Taiwan, and we'll have this, and I guess my view is that that there isn't a coherent doctrine on this, but that there is an attempt by Donald Trump he sees what he wants. Somebody's that the seed on Greenland's been planted for a little while. He can see the advantage, and there would be an advantage of having Greenland at least being even more engaged than the U.S. already is, as the Arctic becomes more important, as the sea lanes become bigger, as America thinks more about maritime geopolitical competition. There are lots of reasons to have what Donald Trump wants to have. So what I think he's trying to do is to get us to think differently in order to eventually make it possible to change the status quo. He's trying it on. And that's not necessarily a doctrine, but it is a way of changing international relations.
It's a different approach.
And I suspect that he'll be successful. Not immediately, but I think that he will, and I guess this is my deepest fear and concern across multiple domains. And I think there are many things that Trump is planning to do that could be good, that could change things that haven't been great. But I think that 4 years of somebody who's willing to take some very good norms and disrupt them in a large audience, in an information environment that's already extremely problematic, I think by the time we've gone through 4 years of this, we will think very differently about these questions.
Well, it's certainly a different way. I mean, it's certainly a power-based approach. It's not a rules-based or a norms-based approach or a precedent-based approach. And I mean, it's quite interesting if you look at actually what he said. I mean, he has, in effect, called for the overthrow of the British government. He hasn't called for the overthrow of the government in Russia or China. So there are some pretty unconventional approaches coming. Well, exactly. So,
but this is they're
so
stronger.
if you're European, you do need to think about those things.
Can I just?
Yeah, I want to come in on that, and then I want to ask you about Russia as well.
I think the other thing that's worth remembering about Donald Trump is that foreign policy to Trump is really an extension of economic policy. Yeah. And I really think Trump thinks of relations with countries almost exclusively through the prism of are we getting ripped off or not? And what's interesting about it is after 4 years of that, and Trump won, when you look at the Biden foreign policy, And tariffs are a very good illustration of this. Biden left in place many of the tariffs on China. And one of the most influential essays that his own national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, wrote in the very early days of the administration is how Democrats needed to think of foreign policy through the lens of, economic interests of the middle class in America. And that is a legacy of Trump and the Trump administration in the first term. So to Leslie's point about will he force us again to rethink it? Probably, and maybe in ways we can't predict sitting here today. But that notion of foreign policy as an extension of domestic economic policy is clearly going to drive him, as it did in the first term, and probably the Democratic president who comes after him, should there be a Democratic president after him at some point.
And it explains a lot about why North America was so central to that inauguration speech.
It comes from home and
Yeah.
goes from. Can I just ask you, before we go to the other questions, I want to pick up one question online, because you said that you wanted to sort of refer to Trump's tweet to Putin on Russia, and there's a question about that that's come in. So from Gareth Quinn, what do Trump's recent posts on Truth Social asking Putin to end the Ukraine war and face further sanctions mean about how he's planning? So can we just cover that off, because he has tweeted on this today. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
It's if you can indulge me, it's actually worth reading. This is
how many characters?
Well, it's long. I'll read it quickly.
Yeah, read it quickly.
Real Donald Trump. I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and always had a very good relationship with President Putin. And this despite the radical left's Russia, Russia, Russia hoax. We must never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing almost 60 million lives in the process. All of that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. That part's in all caps. If we don't make a deal, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which would never have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost. And I mean, this tweet is already generated. It was going to generate about 100 analytical stories between now and tomorrow morning, because it kind of encapsulates so much about the way Trump thinks. One, it's very much a personal appeal to his friend Putin. He drags in the radical left and the Russia, Russia, Russia hoax. And then he uses, tariffs in exactly the way Lisa suggested earlier. Tariffs he uses as a negotiating. I mean, this is not about our economic relationship or balance of payments with Russia. As some smart aleck on X observed this afternoon, you can expect to spend a lot more on the next Fabergé egg you buy. I mean, it's not as though imposing tariffs on Russia changes the equation for the American consumer the way it would, say, on Canada or even Britain. But it is interesting that he sort of thinks that he can force Putin to move on a deeply felt geopolitical issue by threatening him with tariffs. And as several people have pointed out, the third piece, taxes, tariffs, and sanctions, well, we've had incredibly heavy sanctions on Russia for the past two years, and it hasn't really forced Putin's hand. So the immediate instinct of critics of Donald Trump is to say, he's not going to get anywhere with this. But I just thought it was worth surfacing because it gets across so much of what we're going to see over the next 4 years.
Lisa, do you want very quickly to come in? Because that tweet is not all that nuanced. So how do you read that one? Quickly, because I do want to go to the audience, but I think it would be good to hear from you.
Well, I think what he's saying is, Putin, you have an opportunity if you want to get out of this war that is, sapping your economy and your military power. I think it's what he's saying. He wants to see the war ended. He's willing to play a role in that process. But if Putin insists on continuing on with his current policies, then the sanctions will continue. So I think it's pretty straightforward, and I think it probably is more pressure than people would have expected. Again, I think people days, weeks ago would have been fearful that Trump was going to immediately withdraw support from Ukraine, lift the sanctions, and, just let Russia do what Russia wanted to do.
Yeah.
And that's not what this tweet is saying.
No, I agree with you. It's sort of more, it's less pro-Putin than some people might have expected. It's very interesting. I'm going to ask for questions in the room now, and I'll pick others up online. Are you okay? Mark's suffering a bit of a cough, but he's doing very well.
I'm trying my best.
When you ask a question, could you raise your hand? Could you please say who you are, your affiliation? Please ask a question rather than making a lengthy statement. If you want to address it to a particular panelist, that is fine. There are many issues we haven't covered, like defence spending and oligarchs. I'm sure these things will come up, but I'll try to take a range of... if I don't mind, I'll take two at a time. I prefer to do it that way. So a gentleman here on the front row with your hand up. A mic is coming, so if you just hold on.
Thank you. My name is Kayode Adeniyi, and I'm a master's student at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm studying digital innovation. I just want to ask that, what role do you think technology will play in shaping the foreign policy? Recently, you removed the Biden policy around, safety AI, and of course, the largest fund was raised yesterday, 500 billion. And like you just read to us, a lot of things are going on with the internet and technology. So, what role do you think technology will play in shaping United States foreign policy? Thank you.
Okay, that's a very good question, and it takes us towards the oligarchs. A gentleman over here on the front row, and then we'll divide them up as we can. Don't worry, I'll come to the back.
Thank you very much. Robert Walter, Chatham House member and former member of Parliament. I wanted to focus on the Middle East, if I might. One of the very first executive orders that Trump signed on Monday night was lifting the sanctions on the violent Israeli settlers in the West Bank. In his various speeches on Monday, he played on the October the 7th issue and the hostages, but there was no mention of the nearly 50,000 dead in Gaza. And today, it's reported in a congressional hearing, his nominee for the United Nations ambassador has said that Israel has a biblical right to occupy the West Bank. Do you think peace in the Middle East is closer or further away?
Okay, well, Leslie has touched on that, and maybe we can come back and just develop that a bit further, because it is an important issue. But let's do the technology question first, because I think it's a very important part of who were the people who were sitting behind Donald Trump or standing behind him at the inauguration, leaders of major technology firms and tech companies. And they're obviously very important. And also it changes, obviously, the way he's campaigned, including the TikTok issue. So who wants to pick?
I'll say a word. I'm sure everybody's got something
Very
to say
quickly,
here. I mean, I would say it's as much about who has power and influence. Clearly, there's going to be a very strong relationship between the leaders of the major tech companies and the U.S. president. I think this makes it clear that the focus is not going to be on regulation, but it's going to be very much on deregulation and innovation, which it already was, but I think this is very clarifying. There will be, after the announcement was made about the $500 billion that's going into the infrastructure project, I forgot SoftBank, there's already, falling out. Elon Musk is sort of, frustrated about that. There's competition that's going on. I think that one of the big things for Europe will just simply be that I suspect, and we've already heard intimations of this, that there will be pressure to deregulate and not to touch America's tech firms and not to go down the, content moderation or any of that without facing some pretty sharp penalties. I think that's where we're likely to see tariffs.
A pressure point with the Europeans, certainly.
Absolutely.
And of course,
it raises a question for the UK. Which way does the UK want to play? An opportunity that comes with a price, social price.
And of course, one of the other things on technology is that the competition to achieve dominance in new technologies, particularly green technologies, is a big part of the US-China geopolitical standoff as well. Did you want to pick up on this?
Just to make a very small additional point to what Leslie was saying, I think the other thing to remember about almost all of these powerful technology people, all of whom were lined up behind Trump at the inauguration, is they have huge economic interests in China. And so to the extent that the administration wants to pursue, some confrontational elements with China, you might have the likes of Elon Musk or even Tim Cook of Apple, sounding a more moderate cautionary tone. Elon Musk has not minded coming out and calling for the end of Keir Starmer or the the election of the AfD party in Germany. He's not tweeted a single word about China during this period.
But 1/3 of Teslas are produced in Shanghai, aren't they?
Absolutely.
So that's always a useful statistic to
Here
bear in
at
mind.
our earlier conference in Europe, the Chatham House conference in Berlin, we asked this question to, I think, one of your colleagues, Lisa, and how will they deal with, Musk, how will Trump deal with, and the answer was carve-outs, that tariffs, but carve-outs for his friends who are very powerful.
I'll come back to Lisa on the technology relationship with China, but can we just cover the Middle East question, because that's an important one. You did touch on this.
I mean, everybody here, there's clearly, the question, I guess, and I don't say this with judgment, but I think the question is, do you think that Donald Trump can move forward a broader peace deal, both in the current phased deal, but more generally in the Middle East, without addressing the Palestinian problem? And if your answer is no, then I don't think that there's very much hope for a serious, broader regional peace. If your answer is that actually what we might see is some sort of solution temporarily for stabilizing Gaza, and then basically the Palestinian question being ignored and the can being kicked down the road for 4 years, and then whoever comes next, things exploding again. So, it's unfortunately, and the comments from Elise Stefanik, the U.S. UN ambassador, were exactly indicative of that lack of attention to the question of the Palestinians.
If you recall, before the Trump administration did the Abraham Accords, Jared Kushner actually put together a package to deal with Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians had no role at all in the formulation of it. They didn't come out of it with much of a prospect, and it was dead on arrival. Now, to be fair, a lot of previous peace plans have been dead on arrival too. So I think the precedent's been set, and now, if anything, the key players, including the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, this language about Israel having a biblical claim to the occupied territory, you're just going to hear that over and over again. It's going to become an article of faith, and so I think for the Palestinians, it's a pretty bleak 4 years.
Well, the last year hasn't been great for them either.
No.
Okay, well, that's. I think I share your view on that, but others may want to come back on the Middle East. But I'd like to go to Lisa, and I'd quite like to pick up, Lisa, on this question about technology in the US-China relationship and the relationship with Asia. But can I just add in a question from that I've had on the screen relating to your nuance point, which says, and it's from Alejandro de Souta, and it says, how much nuance can the markets allow before uncertainty becomes the norm? And we haven't really talked about the markets issue and the macroeconomic impact of Trump's policies. So maybe it's worth just touching on those as well.
Yeah, I think the points that Mark and Leslie made on technology are both very apt. And I would take it one step further and say, there's been this concern that there's going to be a bifurcation of the technology world when it comes to technology, that somehow there'll be sort of a China technological, world or system, and then a U.S. But I think because of the influence of the technology firms on the Trump administration, their close involvement, when it comes to policy, that makes that less likely that it's going to be a much more messy situation. Yes, I think, there's going to be more export controls on technology going to China. That's not going to end. But at the same time, people like Elon Musk are going to have influence. And of course, they're more interested in having an economic relationship with China and continuing those connections. So I think, you know, it's less likely that we're going to see this sort of bifurcated world when it comes to technology. And then your second question, I think, was on the unpredictability and how that's going to impact the markets. Well, clearly, I don't think we know. I think that, you know, Trump is seen as business friendly. You know, he's a former businessman. He seems to understand that world. So that, you know, helps the markets, I think. But when it comes to the larger issues of foreign policy, US-China broader relations, Taiwan, we haven't really talked about Taiwan yet, that I think that there is some merit to that idea of unpredictability. But, you know, on that note, look, the last couple of years have been extremely unpredictable. So, you know, this is a problem that transcends Trump or even Biden. I mean, this is an issue that our world is becoming more unpredictable. And I think, you know, Trump wants to calm down some of these conflicts. So again, I don't think this is easy to predict or say how the markets will be impacted, because, you know, there are many different issues at play, and, you know, I think it's too early to say, and a lot of it is outside the control of Trump and his actions. I think that's just a reality of the world that we're in right now.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess the impact of the issues around inflation and debt are certainly potentially important market relevant things going forward, but they're more domestic policy issues in the first instance. Let me take two more questions in the room, if I may. I'm going to go to the back. There's a gentleman on the end of the row there. Oh, and there's a lady, Mary, as well over there. So, but first of all, over there.
Hello, my name is Marcus Garden-Hill. I'm a consultant at Trust In, doing headhunting. I was interested to hear your opinion on, obviously Trump coin has come out and him putting his own financial situation first is interesting. How do you think he's going to govern in the next 4 years? And do you think it's going to be to the positive of the American people, or do you think it will mainly be to serve his own ego?
So, yeah, okay, understood. A very personalised sort of personal rule. Okay, and over here, Mary. Over here.
Thank you very much. Mary Dejevsky, journalist. I write a column for The Independent. Simon, you referred in passing to spheres of influence.
Yeah.
Practically every foreign affairs gathering I've been at, say, over the last 10 years, spheres of influence have been derided as outdated, morally wrong, and something that needs to be consigned to the past. Are they being rehabilitated, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I have my own views, but I'm only the chairman. Can we pick up on the government style question? But it's quite interesting. To what extent is this going to be a highly personalised sort of court of Donald Trump? And to what extent is he going to govern through an administration? You talked about the administration being better prepared, and there are different strands of thinking in the administration. It's a very interesting question, how personalised it's going to be.
Well, I think also
partly just because we here tend to focus always on the president and don't think always about the broader system of governments in the US, which is very important.
I mean, and I think, if I'm not wrong, the questioner was also asking to what extent his personal interests enter the equation. I guess I'd say a couple of things. I think his personal interests obviously enter the equation, and I think the difference is that he has moved the goalposts a long way from 2016 in terms of what I think people will be willing to overlook or tolerate. You know, if you remember, his first foreign trip was to Riyadh, was to Saudi Arabia, a country with which his son-in-law now has an extremely lucrative financial and investment arrangement. So I think that will be a recurring theme. And I think the difference is the first time around, it was viewed as outrageous and a cause for resistance and commentary. And now I think some of that has been sort of just discounted. And it's assumed that that's the way he's going to approach things. In terms of the personalization, that tweet demonstrates that he still views his own personal relationship with foreign leaders, particularly in non-democratic countries, as kind of key to getting things done, settling conflicts, et cetera. And as I said at the beginning, the only difference is there were these vast bureaucracies and agencies the first time around that were not necessarily completely aligned behind him. This time around, they are more aligned or behind him and his view and his ideology. So the interesting thing to watch will be, will Marco Rubio be reading off precisely the script that's in this tweet? I assume he probably will. That would not have been the case necessarily 8 years ago. And so, that means that Trump, in a sense, is even more empowered to change the terms of the debate based on very personal impulses and instincts.
And on the spheres of influence question, Leslie talked a bit about this. Lisa, can I come back to you on that? To what extent do you buy into this notion that actually we are going back to a power-based, great power spheres of influence foreign policy approach?
Yeah, I don't think I really see us entering this spheres of influence type of policy. I think, this is something that there's been a lot of concern about in the past. I know in India's case, it's always worried that the U.S. was going to go into what they called a G2 or Global 2 relationship with China, where the U.S. is, leaves the Indo-Pacific region, for China and accepts that China's, always going to have a lot of influence there. And the U.S. worries about its own side of the world. But I just don't see that happening. What we hear is that the Indo-Pacific region will remain a priority. In fact, we may see the U.S. enhance its posture, its military posture in the region. I think we're likely to see that. You've got people coming into the Defense Department who, have talked about the importance of that and in deterring China from trying to militarily, take Taiwan. So I really don't see that idea of spheres of influence happening. I guess you could say, if, President Trump was to back away from NATO or, allow Russia to do what it wants vis-a-vis Ukraine, you could make that argument. But again, I don't think that's where things are headed. I think, because President Trump seems to understand more U.S. power. He seems to be, fairly confident in, the things that he's been asserting and trying to do. Because of that, I think that shows that he's not seeing the world in terms of, China, China has the most power here, Russia here, or whatever great powers.
I've interpreted his comments on the Panama Canal, Greenland and Canada very much in that sense. It's about territorial acquisition, physical acquisition of territory for power.
But Simon, it's one thing to want your own sphere of influence. It's quite another to give up another one. And it's not only about giving up, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the list is very long. It's also a very wealthy, growing, dynamic region. So the idea that you would sort of cede it to somebody else,
Let's apply that to Taiwan policy, because Lisa, you did say we haven't touched on that, and we should do. How committed is Donald Trump to maintaining the current American posture on Taiwan?
I think he is. I don't think he's going to bargain away Taiwan. Last year, when he made the comment about Taiwan not being fair when it comes to advanced semiconductor technology, I think that's his businessman side coming out. That's him saying, we want more Taiwan to, have its semiconductor factories in the United States. He's trying to get some kind of good deal for the American people and on the issue of semiconductors. I don't think that translates to, and if, Taiwan is threatened by a Chinese military invasion, the U.S. won't stand behind Taiwan. He's not saying that. So again, I don't see the policy on Taiwan changing in any drastic way. He may not talk about defending Taiwan in deference to the policy of ambiguity, unlike Biden, who, I think it was 4 or 5 times he said that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense. But I think that he's also doesn't want to be the U.S. president, that lost Taiwan.
Okay.
Again, I think we have to remember that he believes in U.S. power and influence, and he looked at the withdrawal from Afghanistan and saw what a disaster that was, and how weak that made the U.S. look around the world. So he's going to be very careful to not repeat any kind of similar.
That was, of course, originally his plan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I believe, executed by Biden, but conceived.
Leave it to somebody else to.
I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the chair, and I'm picking up on 2 questions that I've got online here. I want to just bring this back to the UK for a minute, Mark, for you. We've talked about this, the divisions in Europe. We haven't talked about defence spending, but that's obviously a major pressure point on European governments. We've talked about spheres of influence, and we have a Prime Minister who's telling us that the UK does not need to make a choice between Europe and the United States. And of course, those are the 2 big pillar relationships of our foreign policy. How worried do you think the British government should actually be?
Quite. I mean, in a word, because again, Trump will view this in a personal way. So I sort of think the trick for Keir Starmer is to say all the right things to Trump about the transatlantic relationship, and then quietly continue to do what he should be doing, which is find ways to get rid of pointless hurdles to trade between the UK and Europe, and then try to do that in a way that doesn't antagonize Trump. But because if he does, if he appears on the Champs-Élysées and announces a new era of entente between the UK and France and the UK and the EU, that'll go over very badly. And it'll be played on by people like Nigel Farage, who will travel to the US and tell him and the people around him, that Starmer is choosing the other side. And I think that's the way that the UK gets itself into trouble. But I do think that with a little bit of nuance and a little bit of agility, there is a way that they can try to do both. And I'll make one rather trivial point, but I don't think it's actually that trivial. The UK needs to play on its strengths with Trump, and one of the strengths it has is his absolute reverence for the royal family. And so the UK needs to send King Charles and Prince William to Washington far more than David Lammy or Keir Starmer. And I think that's probably the best way the UK can get through this period.
It's a serious point, though.
It is a serious point.
But it's a really serious
Well,
point.
yes. I'm not sure that the deployment of the royal family has certain sort of protocol around it.
Understood.
But
Understood.
But it's an age of Trump.
I'm
Protocol.
going to take 2 very quick questions in the room, and then we're going to have to end this event. So, a gentleman in the corner there, and a lady here in the front. Could you make them fairly sharp, because we are running out of time?
Okay. Hi, my name's Thomas. I'm a high school student on an international tour from New Zealand.
Yep.
Under the assumption Trump continues to take radical and often controversial stances that the EU doesn't align with, do you think the EU will reach a point where they will cease bargaining, as you put it, and will instead begin to act in a relatively hostile manner towards the Trump administration?
So, will Europe adopt a hard power policy towards the US? Very interesting question. Lady in the front here in the red top. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Terry Paddock. I'm a Chatham House member. I have to say, I actually find so much of what has been talked about really disturbing in the way that we're normalizing kind of outright corruption and brazen conflicts of interest. But the one thing I will also say just from today, in addition to withdrawing from the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, he has taken the U.S. out of the global corporate minimum tax rate.
I saw that, yeah, the OECD.
Which obviously has implications for all economies, 136 nations. He's threatening to threatening the UK and other governments if they adhere to this international agreement. And it's just, it seems to me, just a giant FU to other governments around the world.
Thank you. So let's fold those points. I'm going to ask each of our panelists very briefly to say a final word. If you could think about, is Europe going to sort of give up on it and go antagonistic? And then this point about normalization of the abnormal. I mean, I have to say, I didn't expect nuance to be the primary word in a discussion about the foreign policy of the Trump 2 administration. So it's a good corrective that you give us. I'm going to go, I'll go Leslie, Mark and Lisa, very quickly, if you would, just final comments.
I'm going to take this one because it's so incredibly important, okay? 77 million of our fellow citizens voted for Donald Trump. So we are required, if we're committed to the democratic process, and you are, and I am, we are required to take it seriously. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be recognized for what it is, which is a radical disruption of some very fundamental norms to our values, to our rights, to our principles, to our way of doing work, to our commitment to our allies and partners. You're absolutely right. But the big question that we asked during the first 4 years, and we have to continue to ask, and depending on what your day job and night job and your citizenship is, invest in, is does the system work? Did the system ultimately work to bring Donald Trump in his first term back into a realm in which we thought that, obviously with some exceptions, politics continued to function in a way that was palatable and acceptable in a liberal democracy under the Constitution of the United States of America? And the sharp end test of that was on January 6, 2021. And our elected members of Congress returned and they verified the vote on that same day. So when the system has been pushed to the brink, it has worked. I'm going to just say that, and the number one test so far, the most fundamental executive order, in my view, was the challenge to birthright citizenship. And we have 22 court cases. So we're not normal. We're talking normally because Simon Fraser is the chairman of Chatham House, and I am just a program director. But it doesn't mean that we feel normal, and it doesn't mean that there isn't all of society, all of alliance, all of partnership focus. People are just more, don't conflate normalization and focus, because they're not the same thing.
Mark, over to you.
I just, very quickly on Europe, I don't think for reasons of either temperament or history or the way Europe is organized, that I see Europe taking a tough approach. I think the EU is not, as a institution, kind of set up to do that. And I also think there will be a new leader in Germany who will probably try to get off on the right foot with Trump. Macron had a difficult time with Trump the first time, but he actually never gave up on trying to establish a rapport with him. And I think Starmer recognizes that he has a lot of other things on his plate, and sort of deciding to define his premiership around picking a fight with Donald Trump strikes me as maybe the last thing he'd want to do. So I actually think some countries might get tough. I think the Canadians might surprise us and get quite tough on trade. And maybe the Mexicans also. They've used some strong language. And I could be proven wrong and have to come back and eat crow about this a year from now. I don't think Europe is going to be the place where we see the real get tough to Trump attitude.
No, I mean, Europe does not talk loudly and carry a big stick. It talks quietly and carries a large carrot. That is... Lisa, your final words from you.
Yeah, just to address the speaker, I think that, no one is normalizing or thinks it's acceptable for a leader to use political power, which has come to them through the people, that they should misuse that for personal financial gain. That is not something that should ever be normalized. And I'm sorry if our remarks made it appear that way. And I guess I would just end by saying, yes, we're in an unpredictable moment. It might be scary to some people because things are changing quickly. But, at the same time, we need to not make assumptions and need to, look back at the first Trump administration and, remember that Trump, does see himself as a peacemaker, resolving conflict, bringing peace to the world, which, is a tall order, and I'm sure, we're all very skeptical. But his instincts, I think, can be positive, and that we should try to build on, some of those positive instincts that we see, and move forward from there. And the U.S. and Europe do share values. They share a long history of cooperation, collaboration. I, for one, hope that we don't see a breakdown in the relationships. It's far too important. Our nations need one another, and we need to continue to work through what many oftentimes is rhetoric, and can seem offensive or rude. Understand that, but I think we need to keep the bigger picture at the forefront of our minds and try to build on the positive things that we can find, and not be totally negative about where things are going from here.
Well, thank you for that message. I mean, that is a sensible message, and I think Chatham House will certainly try to do that. We have to be realistic, though, and be realistic in our assessment of the situation. But we should not be unduly negative, and we have to deal with the world as it is, and engage with the new American administration in that spirit, I think. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thanks to everybody who joined us online. I'm sorry I overran. I'm sorry we overran, but there was so much to cover, and we'll come back to it. Thank you very much.